If you already love keeping mantises and you want to take the next step, breeding them is where simple mantis care turns into real invertebrate husbandry. It is one of the most fascinating projects in exotic pet keeping because it puts behavior, timing, instincts, incubation, and feeder management all into one process. But it is also where people discover that a low-maintenance pet can suddenly become a serious project because a single successful pairing can lead to multiple oothecae, and each fertile egg case may contain dozens to hundreds of babies, depending on the species and the condition of the female. Mantises are popular pets in a growing international hobby, but market research that shows real demand also shows that many keepers and buyers still underestimate the legal, ecological, and husbandry side of the hobby. So in this mantis breeding guide, we are not just talking about getting two mantises to mate. We are talking about doing it responsibly, understanding what happens before, during, and after the pairing, and knowing what it really takes if you ever want to turn breeding into a business. Before you breed any mantis, do not pair weak, freshly molted, underfed, dehydrated, or immature animals. Breeding should only be attempted with healthy adults that have completed their final molt, fully hardened, and are feeding consistently. A mantis that has just molted into adulthood will look ready because it already has wings, but that does not always mean it is sexually mature. After the final molt, the exoskeleton, wings, and reproductive system still need time to fully stabilize. For many commonly kept species, breeders wait at least 2 to 3 weeks after the final molt before attempting a pairing, but this timeline can change depending on the species, sex, temperature, and overall condition of the mantis. Males often mature faster than females and may become ready sooner, while females usually need more time to build body condition before producing fertile oothecae. This is why you should never use one universal breeding calendar for all mantises. A giant Asian mantis, African mantis, ghost mantis, orchid mantis, and temperate garden mantis may all have different timelines. Some hardy tropical species may be ready within a few weeks, while more delicate or specialized species may require longer conditioning. If your female is still thin, refusing food, weak from a recent molt, or not showing a steady feeding response, she is not ready. You also need to confirm the sex before planning a pairing. In many mantids, males usually show around 8 visible abdominal segments on the underside, while females usually show around 6. This is one of the most common sexing methods used by keepers, but segment counting can be harder in some species because the end segments may be small, overlapped, or difficult to see. So do not rely on only one clue. Look at the overall body shape too. Mature females are usually heavier bodied, wider in the abdomen, and less flighty. Mature males are usually slimmer, lighter, more mobile, and often have longer antennae. In many species, males also have wings that extend farther beyond the abdomen. Species choice matters too. For beginners, it is smarter to start with forgiving species such as giant Asian mantises, African mantises, or ghost mantises. These beginner-friendly species are popular because they are generally hardy, feed well, and tolerate captive conditions better than many advanced mantids. But even with hardy species, you still need to match their needs. Ghost mantises, for example, often prefer slightly higher humidity and more delicate prey sizes, while larger Hierodula and Sphodra mantis species usually take larger feeders more confidently. Your breeding setup should be simple, vertical, and roomy. Mantids need height and grip, and pairing works best in a larger enclosure with strong ventilation and enough structure for the male to stay above, behind, or away from the female if needed. It is recommended to use tall enclosures with good climbing surfaces, and pairing guides add extra branches, mesh, and visual clutter so the male is not forced into a direct face-to-face approach. This is not the moment to prioritize a beautiful display tank over function. The best breeding enclosure is the one that gives the male room to approach cautiously and room to escape if the female turns predatory. When you are ready, place the female into the breeding enclosure first and let her settle. Make sure she is already feeding when the male is introduced, because that keeps her attention off the approaching male. Then introduce the male behind her, not directly in front of her head. If the female is receptive and well-fed, the male will often inch forward, freeze, sway, and slowly test the distance before he finally mounts her back. Once the male is on the female, back off and observe from a distance. Mating can last for hours and in some cases even longer. Sudden shadows tapping the enclosure or constantly crowding the tank can interrupt the sequence. If the female attacks before or during pairing, separate them and try again the next day after feeding her more. If the pair connects successfully, leave the enclosure calm and secure. And here is the big myth check. Sexual cannibalism is famous, but it is not inevitable. The dramatic "female always eats the male" story is exaggerated, especially when females are in good condition. If you want to preserve the male for future pairings, remove him once he detaches, as it is clear the mating is complete. After mating, your focus shifts almost entirely to the female. Keep feeding her well and keep the enclosure stable, because ootheca production is energetically draining. A fertile ootheca may appear very soon after mating, or it may take several days. The ootheca is a frothy secretion that hardens into a protective case, and one mating is often enough to fertilize several later egg cases. The real challenge is not getting a mating, but managing what happens next. Depending on temperature and species, hatching may happen in a few weeks or may take months. And incubation timing changes dramatically if you are working with a temperate species that needs diapause. So the real rule is simple. Match the incubation plan to the species. For example, a tropical giant Asian mantis, Hierodula membranacea, may hatch in about 6 to 8 weeks under warm, humid captive conditions, which makes it a more predictable beginner breeding species. Smaller or faster developing mantises may hatch sooner. In general, some smaller mantis species can hatch in about 3 to 4 weeks. A good example of a very fast developing species is the South American dead leaf mantis, Acanthops falcata, whose oothecae have been reported to hatch in about 16 to 19 days at warm temperatures. On the slower side, the iridescent bark mantis, Metalyticus splendidus, may take around 80 to 90 days at room temperature. For temperate mantises like Chinese or Japanese mantises in the genus Tenodera, the timeline is different because the ootheca naturally spends the winter as eggs and hatches in spring instead of developing immediately in warm indoor conditions. Hatching is where mantis breeding becomes real work. When the ootheca opens, you are not dealing with one pet. You are dealing with a sudden wave of tiny predators. Hatchlings are cannibalistic, and if food is not ready immediately, they will start reducing their own numbers. That means feeder cultures need to be established before hatch day, not after. Fruit flies are the standard first food for many species, and as the nymphs grow, you graduate them to larger prey. If you wait until the babies arrive to start thinking about feeders, you are already behind. For the rearing stage, use a container with height, cross-ventilation, and lots of three-dimensional climbing structure so the nymphs can spread out instead of clustering together. Keep hydration available without leaving standing water where tiny nymphs can drown. Rear hatchlings communally for a short time if the enclosure is large and packed with food, but even with the most permissive care, cannibalism becomes a serious issue very quickly as size differences appear. If your goal is maximum survival, separate early and separate mantids. At the very least, start moving out your fastest growers first, because one nymph's good molt becomes another nymph's disaster if the size gap gets too wide. As they pass through the early instars, move them into individual containers with plenty of top grip for safe molts and transition them onto larger prey. Good breeding is not just about producing babies. Good breeding is raising healthy juveniles with predictable survival. Now let's talk business. There is a real mantis market. Research on the international pet mantis trade found more than 80 genera in commerce, and buyer interest is strongly shaped by appearance, behavior, and ease of care. Sell correctly identified, captive bred stock. Label the species and the instar properly. Give a feeding guidance for the buyer. Keep records on parentage, pairing dates, hatch dates, survival, and molt progression. In other words, build a good market reputation. Sturdier established nymphs are often a smarter product than day-of-hatch babies. Buyers care about stage and shipping conditions, and postal rules for live animals require that mailed animals arrive at the destination in good condition without food, water, or special attention during transport. That makes fragile fresh hatchlings a much riskier product. A second business lane is feeder support, because raising nymphs means constant demand for fruit fly cultures and other appropriately sized prey. A third lane is educational content. Care guides, hatch updates, species profiles, and beginner support. In a niche hobby, good information is part of the product. But none of this matters if you ignore the legal side. So do your own research because permits may be required or ownership may be illegal for some species, depending on which country you are. Making sure your species, shipping method, and paperwork are actually compliant. So if you want to breed mantises successfully, think like a keeper first and a seller second. Condition the female and male. Confirm maturity. Use a calm, controlled pairing setup. Respect species differences. Prepare feeders before hatch day. Separate nymphs before cannibalism decides for Yushu Shayu. Do that and mantis breeding becomes one of the most rewarding projects in exotic pet keeping. If you want pet care guides just like this, make sure to subscribe to Exploding Critters, give this video a like, and turn on your notification bell to be updated on our videos and posts. Until next time.